Well, thank you for joining me again, students at Spring Lake Village. Appreciate your participation in these lecture series. So this week, we're going to wrap up our four-part series that was devoted to monastic communities and the contribution they played, especially during the Middle Ages. Last week, we began our discussion of how these various abbeys and monasteries rediscovered the lost art of winemaking. And this week, we're going to focus on one of the most legendary wines and some distilled spirits, in particular, the famous wine Dom Perignon. Here you see an image of the monk Dom Perignon drinking his famous wine. And, many of these monks were scientists in their own right and would play a very important role in the scientific method. Even up until the 19th century, the very famous Augustinian friar Gregor Mendel, his famous experiments on pea plants laid the foundations for the modern science of genetics. So for many centuries, Catholic monks in particular were at the forefront of scientific development and inquiry. So let's begin then our final lecture, Sacred Vineyards, Dom Perignon, and Other Legendary Wines and Spirits. So as we discussed last week, both the Benedictine and Cistercian monks are responsible for the establishment of some of the great wineries, very legendary wines. We know them by their various appellations, or appellations are the sort of the legalized categorization of wines based upon their geographical location. It could be a region, it could be a village, it could be an actual vineyard, but we're all familiar with Chablis, of course, Chasson, Montrachet, Von Romanée, Pouilly, Fuissé. These are some of the very famous wines from the region of France, from France itself. We're going to focus on French wines, but there were also monasteries in Spain and Portugal that produced some great wines that we're familiar with today, also in the Rhineland regions as well. But the wines of France, of course, are the most famous, and perhaps the most legendary is a wine that was planted in the Côte du Rhône, and that is Châteauneuf-du-Pape. Now, the term Châteauneuf-du-Pape, and the translation of that is the Newcastle of the Pope, and it refers to the wine region around the city of Avignon, which was the temporary location of the Holy See during what was called the Babylonian exile or Babylonian captivity, when the papacy moved from Rome to Avignon in southern France, in Provence, in 1308. This move and this new location of the Holy See lasted about 70 years or so. Eventually, the papacy would move back to Rome in 1377. But it was in Avignon that the Pope who moved there in 1308 by the name of Clement V really made the region world famous for its wines. Wines had already been produced in this region during Roman times and quite well respected, but it would be the papacy that would patronize the region and create a sacramental wine that eventually would what the wines of this region would not only be used for the Eucharist, would be sold commercially as vin du pape, as the wine of the popes. And the man who was really responsible for that was the successor of Clement the Seventh, the former bishop of the region of Bordeaux, by who would eventually be elevated John the 22nd in 1317. And he built a castle, this famous citadel, the famous castle of Châteauneuf-du-Pape. And he was the one who really encouraged the growth of vines in the region that would go on to become world famous. By 1344, nearly 50% of the grapes were used for making wine that would be sold commercially. They would be exported throughout Europe and were very favored in Britain. Grapevines and olive trees were planted in the area, as I mentioned, during the reign of John the 22nd. And according to the official archives of the Holy See in Avignon, the total number of grapevines that were grown in Châteauneuf were estimated to be in excess of 3 million by 1344. And this represented roughly 1,900 acres. Under this pope, the wines of the area were renewed each year. And at one point, over 3,000 liters of Châteauneuf-du-Pape were produced. And as I mentioned a moment ago, it was popular among the elite of Europe, this wine, by the second half of the 14th century. And barrels of it were being exported, as I mentioned, to England, where it was enormously well received, but also in Italy as well as Germany. So this is a bottle of Châteauneuf-du-Pape. For those of you who are wine connoisseurs, I'm sure you're quite familiar. I think I drunk it maybe once or twice, not the very expensive bottles, but I guess you can purchase an okay bottle of Châteauneuf-du-Pape for $25. A better bottle probably would run you about $70. But if you were to purchase a bottle of Châteauneuf-du-Pape from the Domaine de Pégau, you're going to pay in excess of $1,000. So those of you who are true wine connoisseurs, you can report back to us of how good the quality of a $1,000 bottle of Châteauneuf-du-Pape tastes. So that's Châteauneuf-du-Pape, but by far the most legendary of all the wines produced by monks. The most famous is that of Dom Perignon, a wine that survived the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789. A number of monastic wineries were shut for good, but a number of them did survive the French Revolution, including that of Dom Perignon, which produces a world-famous sparkling wine, a champagne, that is attributed to the famous Benedictine monk Dom Perignon, who purportedly developed this sparkling wine from his abbey at Saint-Pierre in Auvilliers. Now, Dom Perignon was born Pierre Perignon in January of 1639. He came from a well-to-do family. His mother passed away when he was about 10 years old, and then his father remarried, and she had children in her own right. Her husband had passed away. Eventually, there were 8 children, of which 5 were Pierre Perignon's stepsisters and stepbrothers. His stepmother, Catherine Beauvillion, was a wealthy widow in her own right, and she, as I mentioned, had 3 children by her first marriage. They were Jean, and Marguerite, and she also had a number of extended family members, and the combined family lived in a rather modest house. So even though Pierre grew up in privilege, it didn't necessarily enjoy the trappings necessarily of a upper middle class Frenchman. So in fact, their existence was somewhat Spartan. Again, they had the wherewithal to enjoy a very opulent existence, but they chose to live a simpler life. And we don't know much about his early childhood until in 1652, when he was about 14. He did enroll in a Jesuit college in Chalon on the Mar River. And 6 years later, he then entered the Abbey of Saint-Vannet, which was founded by a very famous monk by the name of Dom Didier de la Cour. That honorific title, Dom, is a contraction of Dominus, which means Lord or Master, and it was a title normally given to Benedictine monks when they reached a certain level. It's also a title that was given to Portuguese monks. But Dom Didier was a great intellectual, and his abbey, the orders of his abbey were very, very strict. Those who entered the Abbey of Saint-Vannet had to spend hours in prayer and in fasting. They had to work very hard, but there was a strong commitment to education. And many of the monks learned the sciences, biology. And again, even though we don't know too much about young Pierre as he studied to become a priest in the Benedictine order, he seemed to have had an affinity for chemistry and the sciences. Now, chemistry, of course, was not yet really developed, but the study, he did analyze the nature of liquids, and it is interesting of his commitment to the scientific method. So under these harsh conditions of the Abbey at Saint-Vannet, he eventually proved himself very able and was elevated to Dom and acquired that honorific title for which we know him, Dom Perignon. So just to review, the strict regimen at the Abbey of Auvilliers, 9 hours were devoted to prayer each day, 7 hours to manual labor, and at least 2 hours of reading. He lived on only 1 meal per day, and he was taught never to be sad, never to frown, not to speak too much, never to raise his voice. he had to speak through his clenched teeth, never make impertinent remarks, or never contradict his elders. So, as I mentioned, he really excelled at the abbey, and he was eventually elevated to the title of procureur, uh, procureur in French. Now, that actually translates prosecutor. It has a legal definition, but here it meant that he served as a kind of administrator or agent of the monastery. And clearly, the abbot at the abbey realized he had certain talents as an administrator. And this particular abbey had only been set up a few years earlier. It had gone through a period of deprivation. The fathers had really gone through a great period of deprivation. And they needed somebody to rebuild and obtain finances in order to renovate the abbey that had been burnt and plundered some years before. And Dom Perignon turned out to be perfect for this role. He found a way of obtaining money from wealthy benefactors and enough money to do the necessary repairs. And he set about to plant vines in the area. And very early on, he ordered the construction of an underground wine cellar. And this was around 1673. And it's noted as being the first purpose-built underground wine cellar in the Champagne region. So it was located on a slope made out of hewn from solid chalk. The main gallery was roughly 110 by 20 feet, and it could hold about 500 casks of wine. And here the wine was stored at a constant, regular temperature. So it already shows his sort of understanding of the importance of wine fermenting in a cold area at a constant temperature. So today the storage of wine at cool and regular temperatures is pretty much taken for granted. And so one asks themselves, we would sort of ask ourselves the question, why did he go to such unprecedented lengths to store wines? Did he know that the temperature would be constant? And if he did, what gave him the idea that it would make any difference to the quality of the wine? So here we have a monk very much sort of at the forefront of sort of empirical approach to the art of winemaking. So what gave him the idea that would really make any difference to the quality of wine? Was he already contemplating experimenting with long-term storage to discern its effect on the quality of champagne? And if this is the case, it presupposes that he had already considered the previous questions and had ingeniously come to the right conclusion. But again, it shows that monks like Dom Perignon were very much scientists in their own right, had great respect for the scientific method, through trial and error, they were able to discover things or rediscover uh, many art forms that had been lost during the Dark Ages and now are being rediscovered during the Middle Ages. So the Abbey and its vineyards overlook the beautiful Marne Valley, which you see here in the upper left-hand corner. This region, the Champagne region, famous for its unique terroir. And at the time, it was very much patronized by the Sun King himself. Louis XIV had given a good deal of money to encourage the production of wine. And it's for this reason and the widespread respect that Dom Perignon enjoyed in his own lifetime that we have actually a number of contemporary sources, so primary sources that not only provide a narrative of his life, but also the art of winemaking at the time. Now, Dom Perignon is often associated with the invention of champagne itself or sparkling wines. And the famous anecdote that upon his discovery of the first champagne, he cried out, "Come quickly, I am tasting the stars." Well, that's apocryphal. It actually didn't happen. Actually, the champagne method or méthode champenoise, we now know, according to manuals and treatises, other firsthand accounts from legal documents, that it probably was first produced in England around 1662. However, Perignon, we are told, probably was responsible for many improvements to the method of making champagne, especially in the blending process known as cuvée, using wines from various vineyards. So at some point, winemakers realized that bubbles, this characteristic of bubbles in wine, could be achieved when you fermented wine a second time. The problem is, and this is, that second fermentation that produces bubbles and the sparkle, of course, is the main characteristic of a sparkling wine. The trouble is that oftentimes the bottles would burst, just spontaneously, and especially if they were stored cheek to jowl. And in the springtime, as yeast began to come back to life, it would create an overabundance of carbon dioxide, and the bottles would blow up. So these, so Dom Perignon studied this phenomenon, and again, empirically, he seems to have found a way to ameliorate, or at least to prevent this bursting of bubbles as a result of the increased carbon dioxide. So again, even though he probably did not, and the evidence suggests that he in fact is not the inventor of what we call champagne, like so much else he did in the development of wines and analyzing the winemaking, old winemaking traditions, he found a way to address this problem of carbon dioxide. So again, there are no primary sources that point to him being the inventor of the champagne method. And he himself, he had been famous note taker. He wouldn't have been shy in proclaiming to the world that he had invented the champagne method. But he did say that the champagne produced from the Abbey of Auvilliers was the best wine in all the world. So again, he would continue to improve upon the méthode champenoise, and his successor, by the name of Frère Pierre, wrote a manual. Here, I should show you first here. This is a couple maps showing you the Champagne region. The famous appellation of Épernay is world famous. Here's the famous Vallée de la Marne. It's a famous Marne River. But those of you who are probably connoisseurs of Champagne are familiar with a lot of these appellations like Côte de Suzanne, the Champagne Gatinois. Again, this is the region of the Champagne region, which is, you can see here, located northeast of Paris. And here's a splendid view of the Marne River Valley and the famous vineyards of the Champagne region. Now, a good deal of what we know about Dom Perignon comes by way of the man who succeeded him at the Abbey. And that was Frère Pierre. And he wrote a very important treatise on wine, which really examines a lot of the méthode champenoise and other winemaking techniques. It's a very important manual for this period about the important role that the Benedictines and Cistercian monks played in establishing a lot of winemaking techniques. And he, in fact, tells us a good deal about Dom Perignon himself. So a lot of what we know about Dom Perignon comes by way of Frère Pierre. Now, there has been long the suggestion that Dom Perignon is responsible for the cork stoppers that are used today, not only in champagne, but in wine. Some suggest that he may have discovered it en route to the famous monastery of Santiago de Compostela. You know, Portugal, of course, is famous for the production of cork, and maybe it was introduced to him en route to Spain, but that's long been discredited. In fact, cork had already been reintroduced into France between 1685 and 1690, and is already now being used in replacing wood as a stopper. And so Dom Perignon very much utilized cork stoppers and really popularized its usage, especially for champagne, for the storage of champagne and as the stopper for champagne bottles. Also, it's been suggested that he introduced glass bottles, and that's probably not true. At the time, glass receptacles, glass bottles were being manufactured by the British. In fact, what was called verre anglais, or glass, English glass, was already being produced, and the French were little by little employing glass bottles. And no doubt Dom Perignon realized it was the best way to store his sparkling wine, even though it had been forbidden during the reign of Louis the XIV. Again, probably because of the damage of storing wine in glass. I mean, sort of this period, this particular period, uh, early on, there was a lot of breakage and quite a few accidents when wine was bottled in glass. But Dom Perignon and his Benedictine order did find a way around it, and they were successful in exporting their sparkling wine in glass bottles. What we do learn from Frere Pierre in his famous manual is that the monk himself, Dom Perignon, scrupulously concerned himself with details that others thought were of insignificance. And again, it shows that this man was so dedicated to science and so much ahead of his time in studying, analyzing, experimenting, etc., that he must rank as truly one of the great winemakers of all time. So, although we can't credit him with being the actual inventor of sparkling wine or as the man who gave the world the cork stopper, there were other areas where he may have played a very important pioneering role. And this includes pruning, improving on the pruning method that would avoid the overproduction of wine and improve the quality of the wine, harvesting the grapes in the coolest hours of the morning. I mean, that's something now that's sort of taken for granted in all wine regions of the world. Harvesting not just one time, but in multiple tries, taking different sweeps of the vineyard, separating the days in which harvesting took place, identifying the ripest grapes, the ones he believed would produce the best and healthiest grapes. The sorting out of the rotten grapes is attributed to him. A lot of this just seems like common sense, but he was so meticulous and exacting in the way that grapes had to be harvested. The idea of using little baskets to avoid the grapes from being crushed, the creation of pressing houses. Now, there's a particular kind of press that he developed, probably didn't invent, but the kind of press that is still used today, in particular for méthode champenoise. The concept of assemblage, blending different varieties and growths. These are often some of the practices, innovations that can be attached to the great man himself, Dom Perignon. So again, in the end, well, Dom Perignon did not invent champagne, and while his claim to have made the best wine in the world might not have demonstrated the sort of humility we might expect of a Benedictine monk, he was genuinely a legend in his own lifetime, and he remains so even today. So it wasn't just famous wines for which we can thank the Benedictines and the Cistercians, but also some of the world famous spirits that we know well and enjoy even today. Of course, whiskey we associate principally with the monks of the Middle Ages who passed on their knowledge, it's believed, to the Scots once their monastic movement moved to Scotland. So whiskey is the translation of the Gaelic Irish whiskey beta, which in turn is the transliteration of the Latin aqua vita, or I should have put an E at the end of A in the genitive. It should be aqua vitae, not V-I-T-A, but V-I-T-A-E. So whiskey, we can thank no doubt the Irish monks, although there is evidence it may have already been produced by Celtic priests earlier on, and then the Irish monks sort of rediscovered or were taught the practice of how to produce whiskey. One of the most famous spirits is the famous green liquor chartreuse. You can see a bottle there to the right, which was created originally by Carthusian monks as a medicinal. It had a secret formula containing various herbs, etc., that had medicinal properties. So, of course, there are a lot of legends, apocryphal stories that we have to kind of take with a grain of salt, but at least according to perhaps maybe the most reliable tradition, a marshal in the French artillery of Henry IV, a man by the name of Marshal Annibal d'Ancre, presented the monks of the Carthusian monastery at Vauvert, which is located actually just outside of Paris, a alchemical manuscript that contained a recipe for what was reputed to be an elixir of long life. This took place in 1605. The formula supposedly included 130 herbs, plants, and flowers, and some other secret ingredients combined in a wine alcohol base. The monks had intended their liquor to be used, as I mentioned, as a medicine, but the recipe would eventually be improved upon by a monk who was a pharmacist by the name of Jerome Maubec at the Grand Chartreuse Monastery of Isère, which is located not far from Grenoble. So this in 1737 improved on the creation of this world famous spirit. You know, we normally it's produced as a green liqueur, but there are other variations of it, yellow liqueurs. Different herbs are added to it, sometimes lavender, but the most famous, of course, is the green, which is sweeter than the yellow, about 40% alcohol or 80% proof. The monks were eventually expelled from their monastery by the government in 1903. Their property and their distillery had been confiscated, but eventually the production of it began anew in the middle of the 20th century, and today enjoys still is widely popular and enjoyed by many today. You've probably heard of Benedictine. This was invented way back in the Renaissance in the very early 16th century by a Benedictine, an Italian, by the name of Dom Bernardo Vincelli. Again, it was supposed to be a restorative, again, medicinal properties to help the monks if they felt poorly or under the weather. So there's a bottle of Benedictine to the left. There's a cherry brandy known as Marasca, and that was also produced in the early 1500s by a Dominican order. And there are other proprietary liqueurs that are associated with some of the great monasteries still strong today, like the one at Lérins and Senanca. Senanca is very famous monastery not far from Gourdes. You've probably seen so many pictures of this famed abbey because it's every spring people flock to see its magnificent lavender fields. So this very famous Carthusian monastery produces its own liqueur with a distinctive lavender taste. So there are many others as well. You know, monasteries also produce cheeses and famous mushrooms, nuts, cookies, confections, but of course, its legendary wines and its spirits are the ones that we mostly associate and still enjoy today. So I do hope you enjoyed this 4-part lecture series that I hope was at once enjoyable and informative and upbeat. Because, here's the Grand Chartreuse Monastery and the famous cellars of the Grand Chartreuse Monastery, where the green chartreuse is still produced. So next week, our new lecture series is going to be more serious, and we're going to focus on a country and a people we have never really explored before, and that is Armenia and the Armenians. All of us living in California, we probably know many Armenian families. I know my own family. I have extended family members who are of Armenian descent. California has quite a sizable Armenian population, but it's only been maybe in the last 20 years that people have sort of rediscovered the Armenian people, let's say in some of its tortured history, especially after World War I, the horrific genocide of the Armenians. So February will be devoted to a study of the history of the Armenian people from ancient times until our modern day. So I hope you join me next week as we begin this important and serious discussion. So look forward to seeing you all again next week. And until then, please take care of yourself. And I do hope, hard to believe it's coming up on a year since we were with one another as a group in the theater, but hopefully that day will come soon enough. So take care.